Hello and welcome to the second episode of Coalescence Publishing's podcast. Here, I am Wyatt Sutherland, and my co-host is Kasey Long.
Hello,
Say hello,
everyone.
Kasey.
Hello, everyone. I hope you all are having a good morning, good afternoon, good night, or good evening, wherever it is that you're listening from.
Indeed. So, just to get right on into it, today we are continuing our genre talks playlist, and today we're going to start talking about our favorite genres, and we'll cover if we end up having the time, and you know how sometimes these discussions go, where we'll go off on a tangent and so on. But today we are going to be talking about our favorite genres to read, to watch, and then finally to write. And I think our audience will be surprised to find some of the differences between those.
Absolutely. So, Wyatt, shall I kick us off on this glorious conversation?
Yeah, go ahead.
Wonderful. So, on last week's episode, we talked a lot about what genre was. We talked about how genre is used for distinguishment, how it can help with the natural development of literature. And we also talked about how genres are similar and how they differ with other types of genre, how there's subgenres, etc., etc. We also talked about how it's more useful for writers or readers. It turns out it's almost equally useful for both, just in different manners. But this week, we're going to talk about our favorite genres. And probably starting off this wonderful conversation, Wyatt, I can't pick a single favorite genre to read. Um, my favorite genres to read, surprisingly, is not horror, but instead it's a mix between two other genres: Sword and Planet and Dying Earth. Um, Sword and Planet genre is probably one of my favorite. Well, I say probably. That's the Southern lingo coming out, guys. Um, Sword and Planet genre is essentially where it's a sci-fi. It's a subgenre of sci-fi, but it takes place on other planets, and it typically features humans as the protagonist or even the antagonist. But the setting does not have a lot of advanced technology. Um, oh no! I got that completely wrong. Why it is a Sunday. um, so the setting typically does have a lot of advanced technology, but the weaponry that they use is very basic. Swords. That's where it got its name from. Sword and Planet. One of the best examples I can give you of this genre is He-Man. He-Man is probably one of the better examples I can give you for this because while yes, they are going through this intergalactic journey, traveling through space, but the weaponry that they use is very archaic compared to the other settings that they're in. And because of that, it creates this amazing tale that just encapsulates you.
Right.
One of my favorite works, honestly, was done by this awesome author named Roger Sherman Hoare, or also known as Ralph Milne Farley. He did the radio series. Well, the Venus series. I call it the radio series because it has radio in all of his works, but the first one was called The Radio Man, also known as An Earthman on Venus. Um, it's basically about this guy who's an engineer who disappears while doing an experiment in his own home, and he finds himself on Venus, where he's captured by this race of like bug-like creatures. So on Venus, he also discovers another race called the Cupians, and they are they're very subservient to these like bug-like creatures that's going all over Venus, and they're very human-like in nature. And it's just a really interesting tale. If any of you all want to get a literature taste of Sword and Planet, I would highly, highly recommend you check out The Radio Man. Probably one of the best works in sci-fi history, but that's just me saying that. What about you, Wyatt? Have you ever read any Sword and Planet stuff?
Well, I did grow up watching the Masters of the Universe and He Man and stuff like that, and I was always intrigued by Sword and Planet visually. Uh, uh, a lot of the animation techniques that were used to portray Sword and Planet were interesting, like the way they made the technology look versus the characters, and that technology has like this 3D gritty, grimy sort of appearance, whereas the characters were standard 2D animation. Um, and I always thought it was interesting. I thought the worlds of Sword and Planet are interesting, and one example I've been thinking about this. Um, since you said Sword and Planet and started describing it, uh, isn't wouldn't you say Star Wars is sort of a Sword and Planet uh, work?
I think part of Star Wars is absolutely. I don't think all of it is in a sense, but definitely you definitely see Sword and Planet when you look at like the Jedi's and the Sith with their lightsabers. That's essentially quote unquote sword and
Hmm.
planet. So yeah, I mean, I would consider Star Wars part of it.
Yeah, and so definitely, I think one of my favorite aspects of Sword and Planet is the it's not science fiction or hard sci-fi as much as it is science fantasy. Like one of the interesting things that Sword and Planet writers usually do is they ignore all sense of like physics and science and chemistry and stuff like that. When you're talking about Radio Man, um, or even if you go earlier to the almost the father of Sword and Planet, I can't remember his name, but he wrote the Mars series, the Mars Princess of Mars. I can't remember some of the other books, but um, they always sort of ignore the fact that these are hostile worlds to like they don't worry about breathing technology or anything like that. It's just the human goes there and uh, it's just adventure from there on out. It's adventure. It is swashbuckling. It is like sword fights. Very just high adventure, high heroism. And that's one of my favorite aspects is that they don't really they're not hung up. Sword and Planet as a genre isn't really hung up on the science aspect as much as it is the fantasy of seeing another world and seeing alien species and interacting with alien politics and whatnot.
Absolutely. And since we're on that topic, I think this is a good transition point ugh, tongue tied to transition. Oh my god,
We'll get
I
there.
need to get
We'll
some
get
coffee,
there.
guys. Um, but this is a good point to transition. Thank God to this other genre that I really like called Dying Earth, also known as Dying Planet. Um, it's also a subgenre of science fiction or science fantasy, depending on what you want to call it. But basically, it talks about the end of life on a planet or on Earth, if you want to be technical about the name. But it's very pre-apocalyptic, and I just love it because a lot of what you see in Dying Planet, works is a lot of what we're seeing in today's society, and it's sad. There's a work I wanted to talk about with this one in particular. It's called Power Grid by this awesome author named Steve Carr. If you've never heard of him, I would really recommend checking him out. Um, from what I've read, he's a really talented author when it comes to science fiction related works. Steve Carr, if you're listening, by all means, if you want to come on here and talk, you are more than welcome to. But he wrote this short story called The Power Grid. It's in an anthology of Dying Planet short stories that I got. And it talks about the most mundane of things that you can hear about in Dying Planet stuff, but he touches on such an important basis. The short story starts out with the narrator, talking about how the tomato plants are starting to wilt and how there's undersized cucumbers, scrawny carrots in the garden, and there's this white sky up above. And that immediately sets the scene of what our planet is going to look like if we do not straighten things up. And it's a very short story, but the basis of it is very important because it talks about starvation. We are already seeing what a dying planet looks like in this short story. Crops are not growing, the sky does not look the same. There's even, you know, grass is dying.
Bees.
Yeah, everything's
Bees.
dying. Oh, the bees.
Yeah, have you not heard about that? That's a big deal in climate change talk. Is honeybees are big pollinators, and honeybees are going extinct, which means that plants are not going to have as much pollination.
Well, I definitely have heard of the bees a few years back. The thing is, back in 2019, there was a survey by some partnership. I think it was the Bee Informed Partnership that kind of measures like honeybee populations and stuff in the United States. And they were on a decline until 2019, but after that, they started coming back. Um, New bee population is surprisingly increasing across the nation. And I think a lot of that has to do with not only the bees getting accustomed to human society with modern technology, because bees are very sensitive to certain wavelengths since that's how they communicate with their hive. But something else that's really driving the new colonies that we're starting to see is people are more conscious over how honeybees are helping us. There's new diets that are incorporating honey, and there's a lot of more public eye to the bee crisis that used to be there. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I say used to, it's still there, but nowhere near as prevalent as it was. But there's a lot of people that's beekeeping now. My neighbor right next door has an apiary that he uses, and he uses it, and every now and then he'll go and collect the honey from it and use it for his toast in the morning, and that's it. And some of the bees have actually migrated to a nearby oak tree, and they're starting to hive there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that's a little feel good story with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my parents are beekeepers, um, so I know a little bit about what goes into it and stuff like that. And uh, it is interesting because from a real world standpoint, um, we're seeing these things sort of happen and change around us. But from a fictional standpoint, when we read things like post-apocalyptic literature, which I know Dying Earth is not post-apocalypse, uh, but when we read stuff like Dying Planet and post-apocalyptic literature and sort of other sci-fi genres that touch on um, changing environments and human fragility to hostile worlds and stuff like that, I feel like that does kind of bring with it um, an awareness. And when people read this fiction, yeah, it's fiction, and yeah, you can just go into just for escapism or just to read about something interesting. But a lot of the times, fiction kind of does inform us about our feelings, like our emotional intuitions about things. Um, so this is a question I have. How exactly is Dying Earth different from your average post-apocalypse story, like The Hunger Games or Fallout?
Well, would you really consider the Hunger Games post-apocalyptic or post-dystopia?
Well, I think it's a post-apocalypse mixed with a dystopia,
Okay.
because it the setting is set after a kind of war, nuclear war, sort
Ah,
of World War III sort of situation, and that's how Pan Am kind of became the way it was. For all those who don't know, Pan Am is the name of the world setting for the Hunger Games. Um, and then they set up this kind of dystopian government, but yeah, I would consider it a post-apocalypse or a form of it.
I gotcha. It's been a very long time since I've read anything from the Hunger Games, and yeah, so thanks for clarifying that. But to answer your question, I think Dying Earth is different than post apocalypticism because in Dying Earth, you have this excellent theme of world weariness going on. And what I mean by that is there's this sadness about the world. Everyone's on edge. Everyone knows their Earth or their planet is on the verge of collapse. It is it is about people coming to terms with the inevitable. There's also a lot of exhaustion that goes on, tying in with the world weariness. But I think the biggest thing that separates Dying Earth from post apocalypticism is the setting. In the post apocalyptic genre, we don't have to worry about something big wiping out all life because that's already happened. In Dying Earth, we do. And in Dying Earth slash Dying Planet, a lot of what we see there, again, going back to what I said earlier, not to be political or anything like that, but we are seeing a lot of that today with the exhaustion of our resources, depleting them, um, famine. Look at COVID-19. I know that's a sensitive subject for you all still. It is for me as well. But COVID-19, the entire pandemic that we went through, is something you would see in a Dying Planet based genre. Um, but that's essentially what I would consider the big differences is the
Yeah.
setting, the themes, so on and so forth.
So it's a lot more contemplative, is what I'm hearing. Like
Absolutely.
post apocalypse is all about, it can be like kind of all about the characters and the society and us rebuilding from a collapse and stuff like that, and all the drama unfolding with that process. um, you got Mad Max, where everything it's they're sort of rebuilding society, but they're building it back in like this barbaric, horrible road warrior way. um, and so but Dying Earth sounds like it's a lot more contemplative, as and like the process is slow and ongoing, and um, people it's almost kind of, and I know you're gonna love it when I say this, but it's kind of Lovecraftian in a way. um, because the forces that characters face in a dying Earth genre story are forces that are beyond them, beyond our control. It's not something that we can react to or rebuild from or anything like that. It's literally um, total irrevocable collapse. And the point of the drama from the characters, just like in a Lovecraft story, the drama for the characters is not um, from society, but from the environment itself, and from this kind of uncontrollable, incomprehensible force.
Precisely, precisely. Um, and one more thing I want to touch on with that is Dying Planet and Dying Earth. It has a lot of feeble hope themes to it as well. You know, it's in our nature and humanity sometimes to wish for the best of a situation. And a lot of the themes you see is, well, maybe the climate is just changing naturally, or maybe we'll find a cure to this disease that's wiping all life out. But we, the readers, we know that's not going to happen. But, you know, it's a very somber theme, but it's something that I think, as a society that's starting to see these issues, that's a genre we really, really need to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Um, but enough about dying Earth and all that depressive stuff. What's your favorite genres to read, Wyatt?
Well, my favorite genres to read. Now, uh, I love reading fantasy. Let's just get that out of the way. Fantasy is my go-to. I am always on board for putting a fantasy audiobook in for any reason whatsoever. Um, uh, I love high fantasy, kind of all fantasy. One of the fantasy genres that I love is similar to Sword and Planet, and that's sword and sorcery. And uh, one of the things that I love about sword and sorcery is like what I was talking about with Sword and Planet. It's like this center on adventure, not some grand world-ending plot or anything like that. Like the father of Sword and Sorcery, excuse me, is Robert E. Howard, and he wrote the Conan and stories. He built the Hyborian Age world, um, and it's a very political world. There's a lot of changing political lands, the empires building, and systems to interact with, whether it's the Sumerian tribes of the north or the very almost like Atlantean sort of very decadent people of Aquilonia. All of these people, and Conan just kind of travels the world doing whatever he wants to do. And the stories don't center even on a through line for Conan as a character. They really only focus on an adventure, and Conan is the main character of it. And I think that's one of my favorite things about Sword and Sorcery is that it's unfettered by this long burgeoning plot that a lot of more epic fantasy or high fantasy is defined by. Um, so yeah, I love reading fantasy. I will say I'm not a huge fan of modern fantasy literature. Honestly, it would be more apt to call it postmodern fantasy literature. So um, I like I like George R. R. Martin, and I like Game of Thrones for what it is.
Which do you think is better, Wyatt? Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings?
I have to say Lord of the Rings hands down.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. And
And there's a lot more to that than just um, you know, the whimsy or the heroism of Lord of the Rings. That I like Game of Thrones themes. I love the idea of exploring fantasy and kind of deconstructing fantasy by not having heroes. You don't have heroes in Game of Thrones. Nobody kind of wins, especially not the people. And it's just all this petty game of nobles. And he took a razor blade, George R. R. Martin, to the fantasy genre and cut away everything that he felt like was um, unrealistic in his view and everything like that. And so I like the theming. I like what he was trying to do, but just reading it is very difficult for me. I don't know if that's just his writing style or just like I can't get connected to these characters as well as I could to Aragorn and the Fellowship. And I think one of the reasons why that is for me is because there's so like if you Tolkien is just incredible with world building. That's just well established. We don't even need to talk about it. Um, but one of my favorite things is that the main characters of The Lord of the Rings, not even talking about The Hobbit or any of his other works, um, are so interconnected to the world and interconnected to each other. And it's so good to see genuine friendships. You know what I mean? Like in a book, you have moments where Legolas and Gimli are just at each other's throats, and then by the end of the story, they are so best. They are the best of friends, and they are so close that Legolas stays in Middle Earth, um, just until Gimli dies. And he doesn't leave until then, into the West, and that sort of character interaction, beautiful friendships.
can I
I think.
correct you on something really quick?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So Legolas did not stay um, with Gimli until Gimli died. Legolas stayed for the coronation of Aragorn and Arwen, and then after Aragorn died, Legolas went to Ithilien, made a ship, and then went over the sea. Just wanted to just clarify that. That
Well,
way we don't have any.
reading.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I read the appendices once. It was a long time ago. I was in high school, and I seem to remember him starting like a small elven kingdom in Ithilien and sticking around. And Gimli made it, but at any rate, um, yeah, the best thing about uh, epic fantasy is the hope, um, and the heroism. And sometimes I feel like modern fantasy just is so kind of obsessed with being clever and having plot twists and being edgy, um, that we lose a little bit of that epic relationships, not just like epic plots, but epic relationships between these characters that are truly heroic. Um,
I think that the twist and stuff that we see with modern fantasy is good. Don't get me wrong, but I see a lot of people trying to recreate George R. R. Martin or Tolkien. Um, that's what I see a lot of people trying to do. And just speaking on, using just Tolkien here as my pure reference, Tolkien created Middle Earth, and the stories he created was made for people to create their own stories out of. And that in itself is fine. But when you're trying to recreate the same type of evil antagonist, the same type of fellowship of people that goes out there, or the classic knight in shining armor who wants to marry the princess, but the princess secretly wants to kill him, stuff we see in Game of Thrones. That stuff I think is starting to become a little bit overused. And with George R. R. Martin's works, he definitely changed fantasy with what he wrote. And he made it a lot more grittier, which I commend him for that. However, that's something we're always going to see with authors is they always try to recreate something that was famous because in doing so they think it will make them famous.
Right.
And
Well, there's like, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
if that's the case, then you know, I am an advocate here at Coalescence Publishing. Why, I always say in our meetings, you write what you want to write. As long as your heart is in it, you do what you want. But if the only reason you're writing your stuff is because you want to copy and paste something because you think it's going to make you money, do not do that. Please. Writing is an art style, guys. You know, you all have an infinitude of resources in your brilliant minds to use, create something, redefine that genre that you want to write in, and that is the thing that will get you prevalency.
Yeah. And I think all art kind of goes through this um, cycle where a new idea is created and then it's recreated. It's kind of um, repeated over and over. A certain style or a certain aesthetic is recreated over and over again, and then you have deconstruction, which is kind of where George R. R. Martin fell in to the epic fantasy genre, um, where that style or that motif is deconstructed, kind of viewed from a different angle, and then a new idea is created out of that new angle. And that's how kind of there's this cycle of art that goes on, and it continues to do this. You can see it with visual art, you can see it with literature, you can see it with music, and um, I think one of the things that is happening right now is that I don't think people are writing with their themes in mind. And uh, one of I'll give an example of that. There's a lot of focus on mechanics these days, and by mechanics I mean very
Automotives.
very no, very specific style of world building that you can see with authors like Brandon Sanderson, um, where you have a magic system or you have a political system like in Game of Thrones, and that system, whatever it is, whether it's magic or politics or uh, what have you, technology, is world built and extrapolated to this extreme degree to where sort of if you when you read a Brandon Sanderson book, and I don't want to alienate anybody who likes Brandon Sanderson. If you like Brandon Sanderson, um, you like what you like, and I'm not shaming anybody for that whatsoever. For me, when I tried to read the Stormlight Archives, um, and it was a little interesting at first. But one of the things that I started to notice is that Sanderson is obsessed with making you understand his magic systems. He builds these elaborate, very hard, very technically proficient magic systems. Um, and that's basically the whole premise of the book. The whole premise of his worlds is these magic systems that he builds. And the whole premise of the stories and the plots is to get you to understand how these magic systems can solve problems. And I'm like, that could be fun in a video game where it's very interactive, where you're dealing with an interactive medium. But in a book, you're using your imagination. You're very much in a book. You're very much operating off of emotional connection to the words on the page. What are the words on the page making you feel? Um, and for me, it was very difficult to feel anything learning about Brandon Sanderson's magic systems. Um, and leading from that into my main point, when people are writing fantasy, you mentioned people are kind of copying either Tolkien or Martin. And I think people do that a lot. Like people try to copy Tolkien's elves or people try to copy Martin's grittiness. Um, when people do that, they're copying a style and a motif. But one of the best things that you can do when you're writing fiction, and if you're writing a fictional world or a fantasy world, is that you start with your themes and world build around your themes. And in that way, Martin and Tolkien did the same thing. Martin didn't necessarily change the genre. He just did what Tolkien did with a different idea. And Tolkien's theme was all about nature. Everything, the entire opus of Middle Earth was all about encouraging human beings to value peace, to value home, um, and to value the natural world, to put what is green above the fires of industry and everything that Saruman and Sauron stand for. Well, Martin did the same thing. He world built um, everything about Westeros and Essos around the theme of power is dangerous when given to the wrong people. And power is corruptive. When you have it, you are many people will be overwhelmingly tempted to use it in the wrong way. And he world built his world around that theme. So when people go to write fantasy, um, and they're creating an original world and so on and so forth, one of the worst things they can do is get hung up on a style or a motif or a system, some sort of mechanic. One of the best things you can do to make a unique and compelling fantasy fiction world is find the theme that you want to write about
Absolutely, Wyatt.
and world build around it.
I absolutely agree with you. One thing, we're running a little close on time here, but one thing I want to add on to that is, if you're a fantasy author out there, don't get offended. If you do fall under the scope, if you are trying to copy Tolkien's work or you know copy what have you, or if you think you are, there is a difference between copying and taking inspiration from. And if you take inspiration from how Tolkien world builds or how George R. R. Martin does it, make it your own. That is perfectly okay. It's just be yourself with your writing. You all are geniuses. I know you guys are. So, um, Wyatt, I think on our next episode we'll talk more about our favorite genres to watch and then write. I really can't wait to get into that one. Here's a little hint: Lovecraft. Just throwing that out there. Um, but yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone. I hope you all have a good evening, a good morning, a good work day, whatever it is that you're doing. Um, we have a Twitter page you can follow us on for more updates. We will be throwing up a Discord server soon if you want to come hang out with us on a daily basis. Just check in. We got a Facebook, Instagram, all that fun social media stuff. We're hip. But until
Yeah, don't
next,
forget to like, share, and subscribe.
oh, don't no. um, but yeah, no, seriously, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Keep reading, keep writing, whatever it is that makes you happy, and we'll see you next time.